you're seeing some diminishing returns on your Facebook ad spend, now is probably a really good time to start considering something like podcasting. We do D2C advertising for brands on podcasts pretty regularly to the tune of $25 to $50 million a year.
As you scale an e-commerce brand, you need more and more top of funnel awareness to be able to increase the audience size that you're selling to. And podcast advertising is a great way to do that.
So we outperform their Facebook ads, almost 5 to 1 because we're able to leverage influence to then tell their story about their product. We turned off our entire podcast campaign, and within that month, after the lag of the trail off of some of the podcast ads, we watched Facebook cost per acquisitions rise over 50%. The later you get into podcasting, the harder it gets because it's kind of like fixed real estate.
All right, guys, in this episode, I'm going to be talking with Adam. We're going to be talking about podcast advertising for e-commerce brands, specifically why you should be running podcast advertising in 2025 if you're running an e-commerce brand. So super excited for this one because I have not seen a lot of content about this on YouTube or pretty much anywhere on social media. So yeah, Adam is from Adopter Media. They work with some of the leading D2C brands and they manage their podcast advertising for them. So Adam, great to have you here.
Excited to be here.
Awesome. Do you want to give a little bit more background into what you do, what Adopter Media does, and what you guys are doing for ecom brands?
Yeah, absolutely. In a snapshot, my journey's been kind of fun. I was a podcaster 4 years ago to 5 years ago, and I ran a niche little podcast about a game called Kendama. It's a ball and cup, and that grew to 1,000 plus downloads per episode and became a side hustle for me that became an income generator. And it was also the thing that sparked the idea for the brand that I used to work at, Fume, to do podcast advertising. And it was frankly the thing that saved our business. It was in a dire circumstance where we needed to find a new channel or we didn't have a business, and we call it $3,000 to $5,000 in at a lucky time, and it panned out really well. And that led me down the road of podcast advertising, which is now several years later brought me to Adopter Media, where I lead our media buying team. And we do D2C advertising for brands on podcasts pretty regularly to the tune of $25 to $50 million a year for performance-based marketing.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a really interesting story, right? A lot of ecom brand owners, especially me, I've heard of podcast advertising before. I've obviously watched podcasts. You see the placements. You think it's only the top brands or the big brands with huge budgets are doing this. And we're going to get into who this is for, who this is not for in just a moment. But it's interesting to me, the brands that are let's say on the smaller side, how can they get started? That you don't have to be a 9-figure brand to run podcast ads. So yeah, we're going to get into all that and more. But yeah, I guess for the ecom brand owners that are watching this who are unfamiliar with what to expect from podcast advertising, can you give us some examples of the types of results that brands see when they do this?
Yeah, 100%. Look, I'm the first to tell a client that they're not going to be a good fit for podcast advertising. And usually that's because either they haven't found good success on Facebook, they're not a scalable business. And that usually is to the tune of, are you doing $1 to $5 million a year of monthly recurring revenue? Have you tested anything with influencers yet on Instagram, anywhere else? And if you're finding success in both of those realms, podcasting is probably the next best channel that you might want to add to your media mix. And the reason is podcasting is a really hard channel to turn on and off. It takes a little bit of investment to get into it because you're paying creators high ticket prices. It's not a $5 a day scale to $5,000 a day like Facebook. You have to commit. And change is not your best friend in podcasting. You want something consistent, a reliable go-to-market MVP product, something that's proven that then you can see results on for 3 to 6 months later, because podcasting has really good sustaining results to it. So I always say, if you're doing $5 million a year plus, you're seeing some diminishing returns on your Facebook ad spend, now is probably a really good time to start considering something like podcasting or podcasting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny because Meta, especially a lot of the brands, watching this would be running Meta ads as a main customer acquisition source. And, it's what we do for our clients. It's, most ecom brands are running Meta ads, and Meta ads is all about you have to do a lot of creative, a lot of volume. You got to be testing. Podcast advertising seems to be you mentioned, change is not your friend. You find something that works and then you stick with it, right? It's it's almost counterintuitive to marketers nowadays.
Totally. The way that I teach our media buying team to think about podcast ad buying is you have a stock portfolio that you're building. You're going to have certain stocks that are going to be high risk, but potentially high reward. But what you really want is a really good dividend earning stock portfolio in podcasting, where you have a core portfolio of call it your 20 to 30 to 40 shows that are going to drive consistent results. And when you find a show that drives you consistent results, it's probably going to stick around in your portfolio for 1 to 2 to 3 years. That's a breadwinner for you. And that's ultimately what we're looking for in terms of negotiations, partnerships, and long-term results.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like it's a very compelling case for the brand that, you know, as you mentioned, 5 million a year. They're like, I think at that point you're likely not seeing diminishing returns yet for meta ads. I think like, you know, depending on, obviously it depends on your total addressable market, right? Who you're selling to, the size of that market. But, you know, even as you scale into the 8-figure range as a brand, being able to have another channel that's not Meta, that's not Google, that's, you know, not email marketing, that you can rely on as another source of customer acquisition, but also that helps the other channels.
Mm-hmm.
Like Adam and I were just talking off camera about like top of funnel, right? And how as you scale an e-commerce brand, you need more and more top of funnel awareness to be able to like increase the audience size that you're selling to. And podcast advertising is a great way to do that, right?
Yeah. And I'll even add, if you're a brand out there and you're watching this and you're the type of product that just has a hard time communicating your story, communicating your brand, it's maybe considered a health and fitness type product that requires a voice of influence to sell your product. Podcasting is a really good way to get into some of your high-end influencers, like your Andrew Hubermans, your Ben Greenfields, anyone in this health and fitness space, at a cost that's approachable, and to then get that influence. For example, one of our biggest clients, they're in the health and fitness supplement probiotic space. They don't do well on Facebook ads. We outperform their Facebook ads, almost 5-1, because we're able to leverage influence to then tell their story about their product, which they can't really do themselves because the brand itself has a hard time convincing you to buy their product without influence. So if you're that type of a product, podcasting or influencer marketing in general is probably going to be a really good friend of yours.
Yep. So I guess like, why does it work? Right? What's the why behind this? Like, what are some reasons that you believe that podcast advertising just works for these brands?
So, at the fundamental level, I think pricing matters. If you can get a good team behind you and you can buy good podcast ads at a good rate, it's going to work. Anything at a cost low enough is always going to perform for the brand. There's always a price to make things work. But the reason that podcasting as an industry and as a channel is really effective for brands and why it's become a darling in the D2C space is you're getting high influence for high potential reach. There's a lot of virality that's now coming into podcasting. We look back at 2024 as a crazy year, like 2024 outsized returns for a lot of brands, mostly due to the election. All of a sudden you'd be on Theo Von's podcast and then he's got the president-elect or the president coming on his show, and now his show just tripled, quadrupled in size. You're not paying for all those impressions. You paid for the episode, but all that outsized impressions now comes in. So you're getting engagement. You're getting this long form piece of content in which if people are tuning into that, they're highly invested in the content. It's not swipeable content. It's not like TikTok. The people that are tuned in are highly engaged. You're going to pay a higher price for them. And the influence that you have, if you've been listening to someone in your ears talk to you for hours and hours and hours, they say, hey, by the way, have you ever tried Manscaped? You want to get below the belt grooming? Yeah, you pretty high influence there to be able to convince someone to do it. So high engagement, there's an intimate aspect where people feel like they are best friends with the host, even though they've never talked to them. It comes like a recommendation, like a friend, more so than from an influencer when you finally get that. And on top of that, to drill one layer deeper, you can find really niche pockets of influence around any given topic. I hosted a podcast on a kendama, a Japanese ball in a cup game. I've seen podcasts hosted on true crime about wild animal attacks. I've seen podcasts about fantasy books and whatever. Like, there's a niche for everything, and your brand probably could find your audience in a dedicated small podcast very easily.
Yeah. I see that's also like a way to almost scale as well, like to reach new audience segments, right? Mm-hmm. That you maybe like, you wouldn't think of, but you guys at Adopter are like, hey, as a wild card, we think your product could work really well with this super niche targeted audience segment and this podcast, but it opens up a new door, a new segment of the audience for you.
Totally. Yeah. There's a lot of new data now coming in due to tools like Podscribe and other research tools that are now showing us a little bit more of where do we find our audiences, not just the show hosts. Because the way that people used to buy podcast ads was not based on audience. It was based on the host. And you would go to the host, you'd pick a good host that could represent your product and pay them a reasonable rate to then find performance. Now, due to the advent of more dynamic technology and programmatic technology coming into podcasting, audiences almost taking the king position, where now you can find your audience and then go to the shows and find even a host that may not make sense for you, but they have the right audience that you want to sell to.
Yeah, that makes sense. It goes back, like you were saying as well, with like the influence is like, on Meta is like you get an ad served to, it's like a creator who you've never seen before. You don't trust them, right? It's this brand, it's an ad, it's an ad, and it's just a hard sell. Whereas, as you were saying, you like and trust the host of the podcast, right? You listen to them every day, every week, like whatever it is, right? So their recommendation comes very strongly. I think it's a really interesting insight as to like why podcast advertising works. I just want to like switch gears just a little bit, talking about more like the technical side of things, about like, everyone knows like the meta ads interface, like you set up like targeting on the audience, like ad set level. And then of course, like we're going to get into creative in just a moment, but specifically around like, how do you set up the targeting? We're just talking about audiences, but also the attribution side of things, like how do you actually measure the impact that podcast advertising is having? What are some ways that you guys like approach that at Adopter?
Yeah, and honestly, this is probably the question that we get the most from brands looking at podcasting. For the past decade or so, podcasting didn't have great attribution. The best you could do was, hey, creator, here's a coupon code. Can you make sure that your audience uses this code? And then we would attribute based on that. The problem with that is not everybody uses a code. On top of that, codes get leaked all the time. So now you have a creator that you think just sold 1,000 units of your product, but then you saw it on Honey or Coupon Birds later, and you're like, oh, well, that sucked. You could use UTMs, and UTMs are great. Very clean attribution. Anyone who clicks on that link comes through. You get some on-site data, all these good things. But then you look at the data and it's like very few people will ever come through it, because who's going to the description of your podcast to go click the link? It's very unlikely that people will do that. Less than 15% of your total conversions are likely going to come in through a UTM click. And so the other two options now that have kind of become more prevalent in our industry that are layered on top of the coupon code and UTM is using a post-purchase survey to validate macro impact. So, there's two that are really popular in the e-commerce space, Fairing, which I'm a big fan of, and No Commerce, also a really big fan of. Those are two widely used post-purchase surveys where you can just ask your customers, how did you hear about us? And, you might be able to see that, we ran a podcast campaign and now 10% of our new customers are saying they heard about us through a podcast. And even better yet, you ask them a secondary follow-up question, which podcast did you hear us on? You'll get some really good insight there. But that's hard to narrow down, and that gives you like macro impact. The code gives you some micro impact, or the UTM does. And there's a story that's usually between those two numbers that you can start to extrapolate. And so under the old model of podcast advertising, you would take the collective new purchase results on post-purchase survey, say 10% of your audience or 10% of your new customers came through podcasting as they attribute, but your code reporting would only ever indicate that 5% of your new audience came in through a podcast. We used to use what would be called like a lift multiplier to say that gap between 5% to 10% is 2x. So then you would apply that multiple onto all your codes or UTMs to say, well, this show got 5 codes, but realistically probably drove 10 conversions. That's like the old archaic way, and frankly, still used to a degree within podcasting. But thankfully, to bring you to today and the way that people attribute now is that there's a huge development in pixel-based attribution. I know you're really familiar with pixel attribution, very similar to Meta, Google, anything else. Podcasting is the same, and frankly, a little bit better now than even Meta and some of the other channels are, due to different terms in iOS that we're allowed to track a little bit more than we can. And there's a caveat that maybe we'll talk about later with IPv6, but to give you the bread and butter, it's not that complicated. There's a pixel that's put on the download of the show or the RSS feed, which is basically where the podcast is hosted, and then a pixel that is put on the brand's website. And when a household IP or an IP address pings that they downloaded the episode and then pings that they came to your Shopify store and made a purchase, platforms like Podscribe, Pod sites now called Spotify, Pod Analytics, and Magellan and a handful of others provide a service to basically do that attribution for you. I'm really biased. I'm an advisor. I love Podscribe. They're kind of the forefront, and they're definitely the one that most of the D2C brands like Rocket Money, Athletic Greens, BetterHelp, and all the big brands use, because it tends to be the most accurate from my, again, biased perspective. But they, frankly, are really, really good at cleaning up that attribution. And the reason that I would recommend them above most of the others is that they've incorporated device graphing to give you even more added clarity to performance. And you can get nearly up to 70 to 80% accuracy on the conversions on audio impressions. Where that falls off though, and this is the one caveat I'll give, YouTube can't be tracked yet. So YouTube is non-pixelable. So you can model the data from your audio onto YouTube, but that's where I find the pixel data falls short is now with simulcasted shows being on YouTube and audio, that makes it harder and harder for pixel attribution to stand out. So our team and what I would recommend to anyone coming into podcasting is don't pick one of those, try to layer in all four of them and then deduplicate your orders. So someone came in through a pixel and was picked up on code. Don't count that as two. Find a way to mix that together through a multimedia mix or on your own back end, and you can get pretty clean data.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, you're like, as you mentioned, you're using multiple different ways of tracking and then you're falling somewhere in the middle. I think as well, like brands can, look at their overall like CPAs as well. Like is our marketing efficiency ratio more efficient, right? Is it improving? I think that's just another way to see like, is there like a halo effect that's happening because you're getting like top of funnel traffic? Is another way to maybe to think about it.
Totally. Well, we talked about that off camera before with one of my clients, Fume. We had a really frustrating experience when we worked there where we had to pull all of our media spend off offline channels like podcasting due to factors outside of our control. But it gave us a really good data insight because we turned off our entire podcast campaign. And within that month, after the lag of the trail off of some of the podcast ads, we watched Facebook cost per acquisitions rise over 50%. They doubled. And then 2 months later, we finally kickstart podcast ad campaigns back on. What did we see? CPAs went back down to where they were when we were running campaigns. So we started to really calculate and go, oh, podcasting is doing more than what it's saying as a channel. It's actually impacting everything else through the top of funnel awareness and sizably.
Yeah, really, really interesting. It goes back to like the touch points as well. Like, the amount of time is like I don't want to butcher this, but the 7-4-11 rule, like they need to be seeing you multiple places. They need to spend a certain number of hours with you. And then, whatever the third one is. But okay, so we've spoken about like, I guess, audience side, attribution side. I want to dive into the creative side because this is really interesting because I talk a lot about like ad creatives on my channel. We do a lot of ad creatives for the brands that we work with because ad creative, especially on Meta, is like most of the game, right? Like you need volume, you need quality, you need to be working with creators, you need to be doing a mix of UGC, static images, like you need the whole thing. How does this work on podcasts? Like, is it similar to Meta? Is it a different story? Like, what has been your experience?
So I'll talk about it in two camps. So there's the host-read side of the industry, and then there's the programmatic side, which is pre-produced creative. So if we look at the programmatic or the pre-produced side, that's your ads that you might get from Toyota or Hyundai. They're not getting a host to talk about their product. They're just going to produce a 30-second audio clip, kind of like a commercial you'd hear on radio, and then run that across a lot of shows. In that camp, creative does matter a lot more because you get to control every aspect of that creative piece before you send it out and then give your targeting, et cetera, et cetera. And in that realm, I'd say probably like 50 to 80% of the value that you're going to get out of your campaign is going to come from creative. On the other side, which is where our team lives, we don't do a lot of programmatic, not a lot of that. That's very different in terms of the industry, but we live on the host-read side. So we broker the partnerships between the brands and the hosts directly or with their agent network. What we provide to them is talking points. We say, hey, we're going to ship you a product. You're going to try it. Hopefully you love it. And we're expecting, X return or X results. Here's the talking points of what we want you to hit as you talk about the product. But ultimately, you know your audience better than we know your audience. So I hope that you can speak to them in a way that is going to work well for the brand to your audience. So we're basically giving them that olive branch of trust to say, we trust you to steward this opportunity with this brand well. But if you can, in that process, hit these 3 things, and this is the call to action, make sure that you tell them you're going to get 50% off when you use code blank, because that's how we're going to point back success to you. Then we're off to the races. The problem with that is you can only adjust that so much. I could tell a creator, well, can you do this a little bit differently or do that a little bit differently? They're going to do what they're going to do. They know their audience better than you. So crafting and scripting creative there is fairly negligible. So show selection and partnership with the host ends up outweighing substantially your ability to craft creative. And so, we've done a lot of research with our internal creative testing to come to the conclusion that creative really is only about 20% impactful for a brand. So if you're at scale, you're spending $1 million, well, 20% is pretty pretty sizable. But if you're spending 10,000 and you're just trying to prove out the channel still, creative testing probably isn't the thing that you should put your energy towards. It's probably show selection, building better relationships with the host. Maybe it's a different strategy when it comes to your offer. Your offer probably has a more impactful, it's probably more impactful than the creative itself. So that's the reason why we don't put a lot of effort into creative as much on podcasts. The host is going to do it for you.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of counterintuitive for the ecom brand owners who, especially ones running their own ads or at least involved with the marketing side of things, Meta, TikTok, like wherever you're running ads on those platforms, it's like creative heavy. But I think it makes a lot of sense as well because you're like for podcasting, again, it goes back to the host, right? And the audience already know that I can trust them. So it's more of like the recommendation rather than like the specific like hook or the angle that they're using or like, talking about X benefit over Y benefit is like a lot of times, would you say that as long as the recommendation is coming from the host, it comes across genuine, it fits well with the host and something that a product that the host would actually use so that it's not like, someone trying to sell something that's clearly like out there, right? And is no correlation with the host personality and what they would use. As long as like that is the right fit, you're pretty much like the majority of the way there.
Yeah, precisely. I think a lot of the creators in this industry don't see it that way, but I've spent enough money to get the data there. But the creators will argue with you and they're like, well, it's not performing because we just need to change the ad copy. We need to do this. I'm like, maybe your show just sucks at selling this product. Maybe that's the answer and we should probably not waste more money on you. And maybe a better product would be a better fit for your audience. Show selection, hands down, alongside pricing negotiation, are the two most important things you could ever focus on in your podcast advertising campaigns. If you pick the right shows and you pay the right rates for them, you can then improve the margin of that success with some creative refinement by like another 20%. But yeah, those are the two most important things, at least in my years of doing this.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's say like a brand they started podcast advertising, they're getting good performance. Just like anything else, like something is working, the ROI is there. Like how do we scale this thing, right? How do we spend more? How do we spend more, but not only that, but maintain the ROI that we need? What is the process of scaling podcast advertising?
Great question. So usually when a brand comes to us and we launch with them, we'll spend $50K to $100K for an initial campaign test between about 2 to 3 months. And what we want to do in that first 2 to 3 months is answer two questions. Is podcasting going to be a good channel for you to scale? And when I think about scale, most brands that are going to be good for podcasting will end up plateauing around 200 to 250K a month. And great brands will go much further than that. But most brands can have decent success up to about 200 to 250K a month to spend. The reason I say that is there's enough shows in that category underneath with a broad enough reach at a low enough cost that you can buy that will get you there. Once you hit that, you start having to buy shows from networks that are maybe going to charge you a little bit more. They're more premium content. And if you don't have a product that's well suited or scalable in podcasting as a channel, you're just going to hit a pricing ceiling where you're not going to succeed much past that. And so certain products hit that ceiling pretty early. Some hit that very late. Some of our brands are spending, $1 million a month, but they're perfect product fit for podcasting as a channel. When I say perfect product fit, we're looking for brands that are high AOV, high LTV, are probably requiring a good endorsement to sell their product and are usually moated. They got a moat around them of competitivity where they have a very unique product. So hyper competitive products, not easy to scale. Imagine trying to bring another therapy product like BetterHelp into podcasting. Good luck. It's not going to happen. BetterHelp owns the space. Athletic Greens, they own the probiotic space, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have challenges there. But in terms of scaling, all it is double downing on areas that work. When I take a brand through a strategy, let's say we focus an initial test, we do a little bit in true crime, a little bit in conservative news and politics, a little bit in health and fitness. And we find in our first initial test, what we're going to do is put you on the best shows that we know in each of those categories to determine early success. If we see really good green lights that 80% of the shows that we put you on are working, okay, you're probably going to do pretty well in this industry. If we do like 20 to 30% are succeeding on the initial test, that's hard. That's going to be a harder place to scale from. But let's say news and politics shows up and is doing well. Well, we can look at all the correlative shows there based on our experience of the shows that we bought that would be lookalikes to those shows and the brands that have been on those shows before. We can look at where those brands have been spending, look at the shows that are like that and continue to branch out in that direction. So maybe we start with Midas Touch. Midas Touch is a very fast growing news and politics show on the left side of the political aisle in the States. From there, if that does really well, maybe you go to Crooked Media. And if Crooked Media does really well, then you go to Slate Media. If Slate's still doing really well for you, then you can go to NPR. And if NPR is doing well, then maybe you go to the New York Times. And then you keep scaling out through all these different ones because pricing is going to get higher and higher. And you'll eventually hit a stop point where you go, maybe we can't do the New York Times because it just isn't working for us anymore. So that's usually scale. That's like from a host-read episodic endorsement strategy. For doing programmatic and doing the other side of the aisle, very different because that's more creative testing, more audience targeting. And if you find audiences that work, it's like Facebook. Just turn the dial up and put more spend on it and watch it scale.
It's interesting to hear because like it's a completely different game to like the usual meta ads. Like meta ads is like, of course, you find different creative angles. Each angle is like, could give you a lot of scale, right? You could have one creative angle that you're just spending 5K a day on. You can also introduce landing pages, increase the conversion of the website. There's a lot of moving parts. And for podcast advertising, it's just like, you just see, it's more about like finding the shows, finding those that resonate, and then just getting on more of them, right? And then, going upstream is like, how do we get to bigger audiences and spend more? But it also like, the interesting thing is, like you were saying, you have indicators of like the test performance of like, is that a good indicator or bad indicator of future performance and scale, right? And I think that's really good and something that, a lot of the times you can't see into the future, right? Of course, it's just a recommendation, right? And it's based off of data. But you guys know that like if this brand is like testing podcast advertising and it's like just not doing well, it's like within that 20-30% range you were saying, it's like, you can give them the recommendation that, look, this is probably not for you. Whereas like, other platforms, you don't really get that. So yeah, it's an interesting insight.
Well, and I only say it's probably not for you if you want a scalable channel. There's probably going to be shows that work well for you and you could cherry pick, 5 to 10 podcasts that are small, maybe one large one that might be really, really good for you. But if you're looking to open up a channel that's going to do 100 to 200K plus of spend for you and scale your business, those are the brands that I say this probably isn't going to be the channel for you. And we're probably not the best agency for you because we mostly work with brands that are going to want to scale and grow.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've touched on, meta ads a little bit in this podcast as well. I want to talk about the synergies. Like we've spoken about like what makes the platforms different. And if you're a brand running meta ads, why you might be interested in running like podcast advertising. Let's talk about like the synergies, like the advantages of a brand running both alongside. Like they're running meta ads. Meta ads is doing well. They want a way to diversify. They want a way to increase top of funnel. They start podcast advertising. Like what are some of the, like, apart from, just opening top of funnel and getting like, greater reach, what are some additional benefits that come with, running both of those alongside each other?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about that Fume story when I worked there where we had to turn everything off. Definitely saw that top of funnel impacting bottom of funnel CPA on Facebook. But on Meta, one of the cool strategies that a lot of the brands are now starting to do, and you've probably seen the ads out in public or podcast studio ads where maybe it's Joe Rogan giving an ad for Alpha Brain or Athletic Greens that now you're seeing on your Meta, etc. So you can contract your creators or license the content from those ad reads if you pay a fee for it to then run on your campaigns. We have one of our clients in the health and fitness space that has leveraged that with the creators like Thomas DeLauer or Dr. Tina, etc. in the health and fitness space at actually a lower cost than what you would expect to be able to get because you can almost bake that into the cost of running your podcast campaign with them, leverage that content, create ad assets, and then retarget out to the health and fitness audience. So now you're extrapolating their influence, they're getting value out of it, and you can scale those campaigns. Some of those are the top performing creatives for some of our clients, especially in those we need an influence to sell our product type category of brands. Where I don't know if that's as practical as, if you're trying to sell, I don't know, toilet paper or something pretty generic that everybody already is quite familiar with. Do you really need to shell out the extra money for that? I don't know. It might still be worthwhile, but that's one of the big strategies coming out of podcasting. In terms of other synergies, when you look at platforms like Podscribe, the data that we get out of that does show a lot more of what's happening on the refer URL side. So we can see directly which shows are sending a lot of people through. retargeting on ads on Facebook, etc., is possible. It's not quite there yet. Give it another 2 to 3 years, and you'll probably be able to pull the lists of listeners, import that in as an audience segment. And then if you ran a campaign on Joe Rogan, you could then run a bunch of targeting to the listeners of Joe Rogan via your Facebook ads to retarget them. We're not quite there in podcasting. Give it like 2 years, and I think we'll be there.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be really interesting. But I think like on the way, like, you know, you're going to retarget those users anyway, right? Just from like retargeting alone and Meta, like how smart Meta is with, you know, website visitors and being able to like hit those people multiple times through advertising.
Well, ab as well. In the meta ad space, one of the things that I know you and I talked about before we jumped on here was, you know, can you use podcasting to amplify your brand messaging that you're already doing on other channels like Meta, etc.? Yeah, absolutely. Creators onboarding onto an existing campaign that you're doing in your brand is a really good way of elevating that thing. And so from a brand awareness perspective, you might want to run a full campaign to a specific landing page for a month. Fume, for example, every January they do a double cores promotion where it's, you know, new year, new me, quit vaping. They do a huge promotion around that. It's great to get creators all on board for that. So those are the moments where we do try to script creators a little bit more so that they onboard onto the already existing campaign. It's going to improve performance across the board, drive so much more awareness, and that's a great way to leverage creative testing. It's usually more, you know, temporal. It's not usually something you'll want to do long-term with a creator. You want to build that baseline with them. But when you can onboard them onto a specific moment, that's great.
Yeah, it's interesting insight. So what you touched on earlier around like the podcast format working on Meta, like it's something I've seen even like for some brands, we've kind of just like manufactured it, right? Where we've got a creator to go to a podcast studio and just talk about it because it looks like there's authority there.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I guess like an idea for ecom brand owners watching. Like, of course you can like leverage and license the podcast advertising that you're doing and use those clips on Meta, but also like just in general, like the idea of like having someone go to a podcast studio and talk about your product, it adds a lot of authority. Even if like they're not like a well-known like podcaster, they could just be a content creator.
Dude,
but
I saw that trend on TikTok like crazy. The amount of like fake podcasts doing ads and it was wild for a season, but it was evident to show that podcasters had influence. Like if you were just there with a microphone talking about a product, people assumed you were an authority figure. Now it's not so much that, because I think people make fun of the like bro podcast or that everybody has a podcast now. So that authority has diminished for sure. But it was a huge trend like 2 years ago. Everybody was doing those ads. It was crazy.
Yeah, and even more recently, like I've heard stories of just like random ecom brands. They would basically use AI to look like someone was talking in Joe Rogan's studio, and they would like say something, and then like they would do like a random clip of Joe Rogan on the other end, being like agreeing or like just something wild. Like with AI and like with you give people this like time. Like people will do like crazy stuff. So a lot of brands were getting like, I don't know if like Meta cracked down on that or whatever, but yeah, just a side note, but that was pretty wild to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So moving into like, I guess the future of podcast advertising and where you see this going this year into next year, because, you know, if a brand is looking to, you know, get on board and start testing this, like, what should they be aware of, like, of what's coming in terms of like, next 6 to 12 months, even 18 months?
Well, first off, I'd say the later you get into podcasting, the harder it gets, because it's kind of like fixed real estate. If there are competitors of yours that are already in podcasting, they have category exclusivity on many of the shows that you might have wanted to be on. And so if you are new, you don't see a lot of competitors doing podcast ads, that's probably a good sign that you should get into it before them and own that real estate. It's the reason that BetterHelp spends as much as they do. They're preventing Talkspace. They're preventing other brands from claiming realty there. 2, pricing's only going to get worse and worse over time, it feels like, because the ego and the influence, the amount of middlemen costs that are entering the industry, that cost to advertise on podcasts is getting harder and harder. And it is a very people-oriented negotiation game. The more you spend, the better the rates you get on everything. It's not like Facebook where creative is king. Relationships are king in podcasting, unfortunately. And so as much as like I came from brand side, I'm not a big agency person in general, because oftentimes agencies have their interests in mind. In podcasting, Sometimes it makes more sense to work with an agency because they have the leverage of they may be spending 50, 100, $200 million a year on podcasts. So you can tap into that existing portfolio of spend to leverage better rates. I can tell you when I worked at Fume before I came to Adopter Media, I looked at the rates that I was spending when I was buying in-house to then when we moved to the agency. Even though we were paying the agency fees on top of our spend, it was still net less than what we were paying direct to the shows prior because we didn't have negotiated rates. So that is one of the areas where, get in earlier, try to get ahead of it, try to claim your real estate. That's one big thing that I would recommend to brands. In terms of developments in the industry, I'll give you like three real fast. One, streaming ad insertion, which it would be complicated to explain in a brief moment, is a new form of insertion that's going to be selling against the listen of an ad versus the download of a podcast episode, which just gives more and more accuracy to the validity of your ads being heard and listened, and then the action taken as a result of them. That's through platforms like Spotify, iHeart, SiriusXM, Odyssey, and a few others. That's newer and it's coming to life a lot more recently. That might be a big impact in the next 2 years. It'll feel a lot more like buying ads on Google or on Facebook. Secondly, there's attribution issues at play right now in podcasting due to the developments of IPv6, which is the way that most brands are receiving IP address information. On the publishing side of the industry, they're still using IPv4 on RSS. So the Pixel is downloading two different types of IP addresses, and they have a very hard time matching those two together. So attribution's getting muddier as brands take on IPv6, and podcasting publishers have not adopted IPv6 yet. Hopefully that happens soon so we don't have a huge issue in a year or two, but it's kind of the big concern right now in our space. Then lastly, I think more and more creators are getting more adverse to having a lot of ads on their show. So real estate's getting fixed. They're capping how many ads, prices are going to go up. And now there's going to be newer monetization avenues that creators are going to take, like Patreons or subscription feed onlys where there's no ads. So your best listeners are going to be harder and harder to reach because they're going to be paying to not listen to ads because they're super loyal to the show. So we're losing some of the efficiencies there. So again, get in earlier than later if you can. Spot the issues to come and maybe adopt something like streaming audio as a part of your strategy if you're looking ahead. I don't know if I'm fully bought into it today. The pricing on it's ridiculous, but I think as supply and demand comes, it'll be a little bit better in a year or so.
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting you say supply and demand there is the same with like the real estate, right? Like there's only so many spots. Once they're all taken, then the supply drops, demand increases, price increases.
Yeah.
So guys, if you're listening to this, if you're interested in podcast advertising, just start exploring it because not only is it like another channel that you can use to acquire customers, but if you get there before your competitors, it's like you're kind of like pushing them out the market in a way, and vice versa. If they get there before you, then it's bad news.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to round off, what are the common pitfalls that brands should avoid, and then how do they actually avoid them?
I get brands that come with all these great ideas all the time about how they should do podcast ads. One of the biggest things that a client will come to us with is, we want to be on this big show. We saw it on a New York billboard. We saw it here. It's this massive show. They think it's going to have massive impact on their brand. The Podscribe Performance Benchmark, which is a quarterly report that comes out showing all the performance data. They just released the Q4 one, and it's sizable to say that the larger a show is, the less influence they have, and yet they still charge some of the biggest premiums. And so size does not correlate with performance at all. You would be better spent putting your effort towards small to medium-sized shows if you're looking for bottom of funnel performance. If you're looking for brand notoriety and awareness, then maybe it's worth going for some of those big shows. That's not my school. I like to get performance. I like to drive some conversions. So we try to stay off those shows unless it's green lights ahead and it's worth us being on some of those to still get performance. Secondly, we talked about it. I think ad copy is something that a lot of brands get really hung up on instead of show selection and pricing. If you put your effort towards show selection and pricing, using research tools like Podscribe to see where competitors of yours or lookalike brands like yours have been spending, follow them. Don't try to carve your own path in podcasting. You don't have to. There's so many brands that have done it before you that can show you through the consistency of the advertisements that they've done on a specific show. For example, a brand might have been on the Midas Touch podcast for 12 months in a row, brands aren't stupid. Brands are only going to keep spending where they're making money. And so you can make a good case to say, well, maybe that show's a good show. I should advertise on that as well. So don't put all your effort into ad copy. It's not going to pay great dividends. It might be incremental gains. Thirdly, use multiple forms of attribution. Don't stick to just coupon codes. They don't tell a full story. They often get leaked. Don't just use post-purchase survey because then you won't have granular data on any shows. Don't completely rely on pixel attribution because it doesn't capture what's happening on YouTube. You have to use multiple sources of attribution, which is one of the incremental costs of doing podcast advertising because you need to pay for a post-purchase survey. You're probably going to be paying for pixel attribution. It's part of the game. It sucks, but you almost need it in order to have confidence in the bottom of funnel performance. Or if you're just a gut-based person and you want to throw a bunch of money in the wind and hope it works and you see your marketing efficiency ratio go up, amazing, go for it. But lastly, I'll compound on that. Like the number one thing you can focus on is relationships, which will result in better pricing and negotiations. Invest time into the partners that you're working with. Build out long-term contracts. Annual deals are your best friend. Buy something for cheap right now or pay fair market value for today's number of downloads I get. And by the end of the year, that show might have doubled in size, but you're still paying the rate that you're paying at the beginning of the year. That's where you ultimately win long-term in podcasting. That's why last year was an unreal year for our clients. We bet a lot of money on news and politics in the election. It paid off very, very well for a bunch of our clients where they had pretty outsized returns in Q4 and Q3.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think as well, like, everyone knows now that like podcasting is here to stay and it's growing. Like, I've heard multiple times that like people nowadays, they go to podcasts for their news or like Twitter for their news. But on the topic of podcasts, they go to podcasts for their news rather than like the mainstream media because they trust, you know, the person that they tune into every week or every second day or whatever it is with their opinions than like the mainstream media. So like, there's been like big shifts in that. Like I think last year as well was a big shift in people realizing that they can get the news and all the other agencies to know at a faster pace from someone they trust through podcasting rather than like sitting and watching the news, right? So really, really interesting times, you know, for brands to start jumping onto this. On that note, for the brands that are interested in, you know, podcast advertising, starting it, but they want a partner to work with. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of benefits, you know, pricing negotiations, all the data that you guys have, plus a lot more. The benefits of working with a partner like Adopted Media. Like, how can they actually like work with you guys? Like, where can they find you guys?
Sure. One, you can either reach out to me on LinkedIn, shoot me an email at adam@adopter.media. Would love to chat with you, and I'll always do a pro bono consultation and tell you if your brand is probably going to be a good fit or not a good fit for podcasting. I worked brand side. I don't like to waste brands' money. At the end of the day, if I don't think you're going to do well, I'm going to tell you you're probably not going to do well. What that looks like to work with us is you on board with our team and we try to take everything off your plate in terms of the point of you saying we want to do podcast advertising. We bring everything to you in a very transparent way to say, here's the rates we're paying to shows. Here's the rates that you're paying us. We'll work with you on building your attribution model with your current systems. We typically work mostly with CPG, DTC style products. Our expertise really domain expertise on the types of brands we spent a lot of money for would be in the telehealth, medicine space. We've done a lot in consumer food goods like Magic Spoon Cereal, Four Sigmatic, Manicura Honey, you name it. We've worked with a lot of brands in the food space, health space, and outside of that, anything that's a normal retail CPG product is frankly easy. It's the health stuff that's hard, and we've earned that domain expertise there. We've been the agency that does a lot of those brands. So if you have a complicated to work with product, that's our business that we've done well at.
Okay, great stuff. Well, Adam, appreciate the time and appreciate the insight as well. I think this has been like super, super valuable. Even for me, like who, you know, we work with a bunch of e-commerce brands, but podcast advertising is still, this thing's a little bit, until today, is a little bit like of an unknown. So yeah, really, really appreciate your time. And yeah, anything else you want to add to the viewers?
No, we gave them a lot here, Jordan. What else do they want? I don't know. Get out there, like get ahead of it. If you think your product, if you got that high AOV product, you got a product that's hard to sell and you need a voice to do it, you throw a little bit of money at podcast advertising. If you're not ready to go all in with an agency or spend a large budget, shoot me a message. I'll shoot you 2 to 3 shows that I think might be a good fit for you and I'll point you in the right direction to talk to them. And if that works and you get great returns, then let's talk and let's have a conversation about how to scale it. That would be what I'd tell you. But give it a shot. It saved my business years and years ago. I hope it grows or saves your business.
That's awesome. All right. Great stuff. Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it.